Hi, welcome to today's lesson on modernism. In this video, we're going to shoot to answer 5 main questions. What is modernism? What was happening during modernist times in society? What is modernist philosophy reacting to? What common pieces are representative of modernism? And why should we care about modernism today? So to start off, what is modernism? Modernism was a movement in literature, art, and architecture. It was more than a physical movement, but a shift in mind and philosophy as well. It spanned from the early 1900s to roughly 1965, and it was focused on experimentation and individualism. I'm not going to read these quotes. They are a little hard to understand, but they're both getting at the idea that this was an era that rapidly changed, and it did not just change in physicality, it changed the social dynamics, it changed art as a whole, literature as a whole, and really flipped our view of what it means to be an individual. So, what was happening during modernist times in society? In modernist times, society actually went through both world wars. So you can imagine that is a culture shock for the people of this time, having been that World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. So this time period also saw a paradigm shift where women fought for their rights, and it later sparked the beginning fights for cultural groups and racial groups as well, which leads us into the Harlem Renaissance, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. And it also peaked the civil rights movement in later years of modernist times. Educational reforms at this time led to a greater demand for literature as well, so that's where literature really sits heavily in modernism, because it shifted how we write and what we write about, and kind of why we write about it. So, the Harlem Renaissance was a literary movement that brought forth African American culture into the arts, particularly into literature. It sought to reconceptualize the Negro apart from the white stereotypes that had influenced Black people's relationships to their heritage and to each other. It laid the groundwork for all later African American literature, and in some ways it really fueled the civil rights movement. It finally gave the necessary voice to people of color that they deserved, and it was their pushback through the arts to say, we're not going anywhere, and we have important things to say. Listed at the bottom there are a few prominent writers of the Harlem Renaissance time period, and this is a quote from one of them. "Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly." That was Langston Hughes. So, what is modernist philosophy reacting to? It's reacting to experimentation and outbreak of individualism. It's a rejection of the moral and religious principles. Prior to this time period, there was a lot of conformity, a lot of strict rules of society of this is how you should live, this is the right way to live, and people didn't want to step outside of that box until modernist times. And in modernism, there was a unifying theme of a conscious search for identity. So, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be modern? It really focused on the inner self and consciousness. You may have heard of stream of consciousness before. This is sort of what sparked that. A lot of times writers would kind of word vomit in a way and just get all of their thoughts out on paper, and then that became kind of a way to make understanding in this chaotic time period. It was a break from the traditions in many different ways. So, it was a reaction to a shift in social dynamics and hierarchies. There was less fear to delve into the taboo, broke the structures, and brought forth a directness that previous periods lacked. At this time, Sigmund Freud's theories about the inner workings of the human and the newfound literature were both two focuses that altered people's understandings of the realities and truths around them. The Lost Generation was a group of writers that were struggling to make meaning in a world of chaos. Having lived through both world wars, you can imagine that this group was feeling lost and confused and just trying some way to make sense of everything that was going on around them. Writers focused on turning the mind's eye inward and recording the workings of consciousness. Gertrude Stein is one of the authors at this time, and they said, "That is what you are, that's what you all are. All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation." And you can imagine the truth of this at that time. This was a quote that I pulled that really, I think, summed up what modernist philosophy was reacting to. All truth became relative, conditional, and in flux. The war demonstrated that no guiding spirit rules the events of the world, and that absolute destruction was kept in check by only the tiniest of margins. So their whole religion-based society was falling apart in front of them, and they had to figure out, what does this mean now for us? Who are we now after everything that's happened? One of the big texts in modernist times was The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway really broke some of the traditional writing styles where he left fragmentation, so pieces were unknown to readers. There was a lot of room for interpretation in his shortened and fragmented sentences and character thoughts. Sometimes he wouldn't even tell you which character is saying what. And just writing about the everyday goings-on instead of focusing on society as a whole, looking at the individual, what is happening in them, how are they making sense of everything going on around them, his different ways of characterization. He was considered a part of the lost generation. Similarly, so was The Great Gatsby and F. Scott Fitzgerald, also considered part of the lost generation, focusing on moral corruption, making sense of a world driven by money and greed and the American dream really coming about at this time. Also broke a lot of the traditional writing practices, so he had lack of chronological order in this book, imperfect narration, just different themes that really challenged what themes were prominent before modernism. So artwork in modernism also made a big shift. This is an example of pop art, which was a subcategory of modernism. As you can see, he uses Marilyn Monroe, so that's kind of what pop art means, is using recognizable imagery from advertisements, celebrities, etc. that could be pulled and put into a piece of art. Another prominent artist was Georgia O'Keeffe. For her abstraction and representation, she also had a lot of kind of taboo topics in her pictures where she broke the standard of femininity in that way and kind of speaking out about women and the gender balance in the artistic scene. And Salvador Dali, he was part of the surrealism, which is also like a subcategory of modernism, rejection of rationalism and literary realism, focusing on the unconscious mind and pushing the limits of imagination. So why should we care about modernism today? We should care because it still influences us. It asks many of the same questions that we're still looking for the answers to, and it helped shape where we are today. It sparked individualism and the search for who we are, and the ideals and philosophies brought up in modernist times are still here in postmodern times as well. Those are the references for today's lesson. So thank you for watching, and I hope you'll explore more about modernism.